I sat down at the head of the Thanksgiving table with my right arm in a sling and a cast that ran from my knuckles to my elbow. I couldn't even hold a fork. The turkey sat in front of me, golden and steaming, and I just stared at it like it was a stranger. My daughter watched me from across the table, her face unreadable. And then she set down her wineglass and said, "Calm as anything. My husband taught him a lesson." The dining room went quiet. 12 people. Her in-laws, my brother, my sister-in-law, the neighbors, the kids. All of them froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, grinning like he'd just won a poker tournament. "Damn right I did," he said, loud enough that the kids at the other table looked up. The old man thought he was the boss around here, thought he could push me around in my own house. Well, I showed him who's the boss now, didn't I, Dad? He raised his glass to me. Cheers. I smiled. That was it. I just smiled and reached for my water glass with my left hand and took a slow sip. He thought I was broken. He thought the cast on my arm was the end of something he didn't know was the beginning. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. He stood up to answer it, still smug, still high on the sound of his own voice. I watched him cross the living room. I watched him reach for the handle. I watched the color drain out of his face when he opened the door. 2 federal marshals, badges out, and behind them a man I'd worked with for 26 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Royce Avonmore. I'm 68 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades with the Department of Justice, the last 20 as a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District. I retired 4 years ago to a quiet life in a quiet house in a quiet part of Connecticut, and the loudest thing I expected to deal with was the deer that kept eating my wife's tulips. My wife, Marlo, passed 18 months ago. Pancreatic, it was fast, and it was cruel, and it left me hollowed out in a way I didn't know a person could be hollowed out. My daughter Sutton was the one who held me up through it. She came home from the city every weekend, made me eat, made me shower, made me get out of the chair. She'd been my whole heart from the day she was born, and after Marlo died, she was all I had left. So when she told me last spring that she was getting serious with a man named Tate Bellwether, I tried to be happy for her. I tried hard. I didn't like him. I didn't trust him. But I'd been a prosecutor long enough to know that I read people for a living, and sometimes that made me suspicious of perfectly good ones. So I kept my mouth shut, and I smiled at the dinners, and I shook his hand, and I told myself I was being a stubborn old man. They got married in June. Small ceremony, just family, in the backyard of the old house. Sutton wore her mother's pearls. I gave her away with my left hand around her arm and my right hand pressed hard against my pocket so nobody would see it shaking. By August, things started to change. It was small at first. Sutton stopped calling on Sundays. When I called her, Tate answered. "She's resting," he'd say. Or, "She's at the gym." Or, "Why don't I have her call you back tomorrow?" She never called back. I'd see her on Instagram, smiling at some restaurant in the city, and then I'd realize she hadn't returned my last 3 texts. In September, I drove down to see her without warning. Tate answered the door in a bathrobe at 4 in the afternoon and looked annoyed to see me. He didn't invite me in. He stood in the doorway and told me Sutton was in the shower and that I should have called first. I stood on the stoop and asked him to tell her I'd come by. He said he would. He didn't. I found out a week later when she finally called me. "Dad, why didn't you say you were coming down?" Her voice was small, confused. "Tate said he hadn't seen you in a month." That was the first lie I caught him in. It wasn't the last. Over the next 2 months, I started keeping a notebook. Old habits. When you spend your life building cases, you don't stop just because you're retired. I wrote down dates. I wrote down what Sutton said. I wrote down what Sutton said. I wrote down the things that didn't add up. The phone calls she didn't return. The plans that got canceled at the last minute. The bruise I noticed on her forearm at her birthday dinner in October that she said she'd gotten from bumping into the kitchen counter. The way her eyes flicked to him before she answered any question I asked her. The fact that she'd lost 10 pounds since June and her wedding ring spun loose on her finger. I've prosecuted men like Tate Bellwether before. I've put 19 of them in federal prison. I know the pattern. The isolation. The control. The slow erosion of a person until there's nothing left but a thing he can move around like furniture. But knowing it and proving it are two different animals, and knowing it about your own daughter is another animal entirely. In early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Sutton called me crying. It was 11 at night. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong. She just kept saying, "I think I made a mistake, Dad. I think I made a really big mistake." Then I heard him in the background, his voice low, hard. "Who are you talking to?" The line went dead. I called back. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I drove to the city at 2 in the morning. I sat outside their building in my car until the sun came up. At 7, Tate came out in running clothes and went down the block. I went up. The doorman knew me. He led me up to her floor. She opened the door, and her face was bruised. Right side, cheek to jaw. The kind of yellow-purple bloom that's already 3 or 4 days old. She tried to close the door, but I put my foot in it. "Sutton. Dad, please go." "Sutton, look at me." She looked at me. Her eyes were red, and there was something underneath the red, something I'd seen 100 times in witness rooms and never thought I'd see in my own child. Shame. Pure shame. The kind that won't let a person ask for help even when she's drowning. "He's going to be back in 20 minutes, she said. "Please, Dad, please." I told her I loved her. I told her I'd be here when she was ready. I told her if he ever put a hand on her again, I would handle it. And then I left, because I knew if I stayed, I'd do something that would help me feel better and not help her at all. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat in the kitchen, and I watched the sun come through the window over the sink, and I started planning. Here is what I knew about my son-in-law after 6 months of quiet observation. He came from money, but didn't have any of his own. His parents had cut him off in his late 20s after a series of bad investments and a DUI he'd settled out of court. He'd been bouncing around the edges of the New York finance world for a decade, never lasting more than 2 years at any firm. The job he had when he met Sutton was at a boutique investment shop that I later learned was being investigated by the SEC. He was charming on a first impression and exhausting on a fifth. He drank too much and he lost his temper, and he believed at his core that the world owed him a debt he was finally getting around to collecting. He'd married my daughter because she'd just inherited $4.1 million from her mother's life insurance and her grandmother's trust. I knew this because I was the trustee. I'd structured the trust myself 10 years ago with my old colleague at the firm who handled estate work. I knew exactly how much money was in there, and I knew exactly how it was protected. What Tate didn't know, because Sutton hadn't told him, was that the trust had a clause in it, a clause I'd insisted on when I drafted it, against the wishes of my late mother-in-law, who'd wanted Sutton to have unfettered access at 35. The clause was simple. In the event of Sutton's death, the assets would not pass to her spouse. They would pass to a charitable foundation in her mother's name. I drafted that clause because I had spent my career watching what happens to women with money who marry the wrong men. I made one phone call that morning to my old partner, Calder Renfrew, who'd retired the same year I did and now ran a small private security firm out of an office in Stamford. Calder and I went back to law school. We'd worked organized crime cases together in the 80s. He owed me favors I'd long stopped counting, and I owed him the same. I told him what I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "What do you need, Royce? I need to know what he's planning." "You think he's planning something. I think he hits her, and I think $4 million is more useful to a man like that with her dead than alive." There was a pause. Then Calder said, "Give me 2 weeks." He took 10 days. What Calder brought me on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November was a file, photos, bank records, A text message exchange between Tate and a man named Rusk, an old college friend who ran a small charter operation up in the Adirondacks. The texts went back 4 months. They were careful at first, vague, full of phrases like the situation and her arrangement. But men who think they're clever always slip eventually. By October, Tate was complaining openly that she still hasn't shown me the trust documents, and I need to know what's in there before we go forward. By the first week of November, Rusk had agreed to host them at his cabin over Thanksgiving weekend. There was a stretch of trail near the property, Rusk said, that ran along a ridge above a frozen creek. People fell there. People had fallen there before. The last text in the file was from Tate, dated November 9th. It said, "She's got a habit of walking ahead of me. It'll look natural." I read that text 3 times. I put the file down. I went out to the back porch and I sat there for an hour without moving. Then I came back inside and I called her and I said, "Here's what we're going to do." The plan I built had 3 parts. The first part was getting Sutton out safely, without him knowing she was out. That was the hardest part. I couldn't just pull her. He'd watch her phone, her car, her movements. If she disappeared, he'd run. And once he ran, the case I was building would unravel. The second part was setting the trap. He had to commit. He had to do something on the record that I could put in front of a federal judge. Conspiracy to commit murder is a hard charge to prove on text messages alone, especially when defense counsel can argue the texts are jokes, fantasy, locker room talk. I needed him to act. The third part was Thanksgiving. The lesson, as Sutton would later put it, the part where he learned, in front of every person whose opinion he cared about, exactly who he had married into. For the first part, I used my brother's wife, Penelope, who is a retired emergency room nurse and the most unflappable woman I have ever known in my life. Penelope called Sutton on a Wednesday and told her in a voice so warm and so casual that anyone listening on the line would have thought it was the most ordinary conversation in the world, that she'd been diagnosed with a benign mass and was going in for a routine procedure the following Monday. She wanted Sutton to come up to the house in Connecticut for the weekend before, just for company. Just 2 nights. A quiet visit before the holiday hustle. Sutton, who loved her aunt and who had been looking, I think, for any excuse to be somewhere safe, said yes immediately. When she got to my house that Friday afternoon, I sat her down at the kitchen table and I told her everything. The texts. The cabin. The ridge above the creek. The clause in the trust she had never read. She didn't cry. That's what I remember most. She listened with her hands folded in her lap, and when I was done, she said very quietly, "I knew." You knew? Not all of it. Not the cabin. Not Rusk. But I knew, Dad. The last few weeks I knew. I just didn't know what to do. I reached across the table and I took her hand in my left hand and I held it. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do," I said. "And in 3 weeks, this is going to be over, and you are going to have the rest of your life back." She nodded. Then she said, "Are you going to make him hurt?" I'd been a prosecutor for 40 years. I had stood in front of juries and asked them to send men away for the rest of their natural lives. I had argued for the maximum, and I had meant every word of it. But I had never, not once, made a case personal. I'd always told the young attorneys in my office the same thing. The law isn't your weapon, it's your responsibility. I looked at my daughter's bruised face and I said, yes, I'm going to make him hurt. The second part took the longest. We sent Sutton back to him on Sunday night. She was wired. Calder's people had set up a cloned line for her phone, so every text and every call went through our office in Stamford in real time. She wore a small recording device, the size of a button, sewn into the lining of her purse. We coached her for 2 days on how to act normal, how to keep eye contact, how to laugh at his jokes, how not to flinch. She was better at it than I expected. She is, after all, my daughter. For 2.5 weeks, she lived in that apartment with him, and she gathered evidence. She got him on tape in the kitchen, asking her if she'd talked to your dad's lawyer about the paperwork yet. She got him on tape in the bedroom, asking her if she remembered the password to her trust portal. She got him on tape in the car, telling Rusk on speaker that everything's on track for the weekend. The Friday before Thanksgiving, Tate told her that there had been a change of plans. His old friend Rusk had invited them up to the Adirondacks for the long weekend. A surprise. A romantic getaway before the family obligations started. He'd already cleared it with me, he said. Her dad was fine with celebrating Thanksgiving on Sunday instead of Thursday. Of course, he had not cleared it with me. I had told him 3 weeks earlier, when he'd floated the idea, that Thanksgiving was the one holiday Marlo and I had never missed in 42 years of marriage, and that I expected to see them at my table on Thursday at 3 o'clock sharp. I had said this in front of 2 witnesses. I had also, just for fun, sent him a follow-up email confirming the date. He'd written back with a thumbs-up emoji. He thought he was managing me. He didn't know I'd been managing him since June. Sutton, on cue, told him she was uncomfortable lying to her father. She suggested a compromise. They'd go up to the cabin Wednesday night, spend Thursday morning doing the romantic thing, and drive down Thursday afternoon for dinner at my house. They'd be back by 3. He could play the doting husband for a few hours, and then they'd go home. He agreed. He was so eager to get her up to that cabin that he agreed to anything. What he didn't know was that the cabin had been wired by Calder's people on the previous Monday, while Rusk was in Albany at a dental appointment. What he didn't know was that the trail he and Rusk had picked out, the one along the ridge above the creek, had been walked by federal investigators with cameras 3 days earlier. What he didn't know was that a U.S. Marshals task force, working with my old office on a referral I'd quietly made through Calder, had been watching him for 9 days. They went up Wednesday night. He drove. Sutton sat in the passenger seat with the recording device sewn into her coat collar and a panic button under her thumb on the door handle. When they pulled into the cabin's gravel drive, 2 agents were already in position in the woods. 3 more were in a vehicle a half-mile up the road. I was in Calder's office in Stamford watching the feed. He didn't make his move that night. He waited until Thursday morning the way he'd planned. He woke her at 7, said the light was beautiful, said they should walk before breakfast. She put on her coat. She put her hand on the panic button in her pocket. She walked ahead of him on the trail, the way he told Rusk in that text 2 weeks earlier. The way that would look natural. The recording, when I listened to it later, lasts 4 minutes and 31 seconds. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. You can hear his footsteps quicken as the trail narrows. You can hear the creek below, ice cracking somewhere far down. You can hear him say, "Hey babe, look at this." And then you can hear his hands on her shoulders. And then you can hear her say, very loudly and very clearly, "Tate, what are you doing?" That was the cue. 6 federal agents came out of the woods in 11 seconds. He went face down in the snow. She walked back to me without looking at him. But here is the thing I want you to understand. That's not where the story ended, because if it had ended there, in the snow, with him in handcuffs and her in shock, and the agents reading him his rights, it would have been clean, but it wouldn't have been right. He would have been just another defendant. A name on a docket. A case number. I wanted him to know, not later, in a courtroom, with his lawyer translating everything through the filter of legal procedure. I wanted him to know in his own body, at the exact moment he felt most safe. I wanted him to taste the drop. So we let him go. That's right. We let him go. I called the agent in charge, a woman named Dareth Holloway, whom I'd hired out of Yale Law 20 years ago, and who now ran the field office in Albany. I told her what I wanted. She thought about it for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Royce, this is a hell of a thing to ask. I know. You're sure about this?" "I'm sure." She made it happen. The agents pulled back. Sutton, who had been briefed for this exact possibility, told Tate in the cabin, with tears in her eyes that were 90% acting and 10% rage, that she had slipped on the trail, that she'd panicked, that the men in the woods were just hunters, that she was so sorry, so sorry. She didn't know what had come over her. Please, don't be mad. He bought it. He bought every word of it. Because in his mind, he was the smart one, and she was the soft one, and of course she'd panic, and of course she'd apologize. That was the whole shape of his marriage. That was the whole shape of his life. They drove down to my house Thursday afternoon. He was quiet on the drive. She told me later he kept looking at her sideways, trying to figure out if she was acting strangely. He couldn't tell. She'd gotten that good. Now the arm. The cast on my arm was real. The break was not. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I went to my orthopedist, a man I've known for 30 years, and I asked him for a favor. I told him I needed a soft cast material, sling, the whole presentation. No actual injury. He looked at me over his reading glasses, and he said, "Royce, what in God's name?" I told him. He cast me up that afternoon. When Tate and Sutton walked in my house at 2:50 on Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my chair in the living room with my arm in a sling, my face slightly pale, a bandage on my temple. I looked at Tate and I said, in a voice that was deliberately weak, "I had a fall yesterday, out at the woodpile. Doctor says I have to take it easy for a while." He almost laughed. I watched him almost laugh. I watched him try to hide it. He'd been planning to come into this house and play the dutiful son-in-law to a man he was about to widow, and now he was being handed, on top of everything else, the gift of a frail old father-in-law who'd hurt himself splitting wood. He thought God was on his side. He sat down at my dinner table at 3. He had a glass of wine. He had another. He told a story about his college days. He laughed at his own jokes. By the time the turkey came out, he was loose and red-faced and certain of himself in a way that men like him only get when they think they've won. Sutton walked into the dining room with the gravy. She set it down in front of me. She looked at me and her eyes were calm. I put my left hand on hers. She turned to the table. "My husband," she said very gently, "taught him a lesson," she said very gently, "taught him a lesson." The room hushed. 12 faces turning toward her, 12 forks pausing. And Tate, oh Tate, leaning back in his chair and grinning and raising his glass. Damn right I did. The old man thought he was the boss around here. I showed him. I smiled at him. That was when the doorbell rang. He answered it himself. He was so high on himself, so sure of his place in the room, that he stood up to play the host. He crossed the living room with his wine glass still in his hand. He opened the door. 2 federal marshals. Dareth Holloway behind them in a long black coat, her badge clipped to her lapel, and behind her my old colleague from the Eastern District, the U.S. Attorney himself, a man named Halverson Pike, who had flown up from D.C. that morning as a personal favor to me. Tate's wine glass slipped out of his hand and shattered on the foyer tile. Halverson stepped forward. He read the charges. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, wire fraud because of the trust portal, federal racketeering charges connected to Rusk in the cabin, 12 counts in all. He read them slowly in his courtroom voice, the one I'd heard him use 100 times. He wanted the dining room to hear every word. The dining room heard. My brother stood up halfway through the reading. His wife pulled him back down. The neighbors stared at the floor. Tate's mother, who had never liked and who had spent the entire dinner correcting my daughter's table manners, made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. A small animal sound like something giving way. When Halverson was done, the marshals stepped forward and put Tate in cuffs. He didn't fight. He'd gone gray. He looked at Sutton across the room and his mouth opened and nothing came out. Sutton walked over to him. She walked right up to him, until she was a foot away and she looked at his face. Then she said, "I read the trust last week, Tate, the one you kept asking about. I read every page of it. My father drafted it 10 years ago. There's a clause in there about what happens if I die before you. Do you want to know what it says?" He didn't answer. "It says you don't get $1, she said. "It says it goes to my mother's foundation, every penny." She held up her left hand and slit her wedding ring off and dropped it into his shirt pocket. "I'll see you in court," she said. The marshals walked him out. The door closed behind him. Sutton stood in the foyer for a long moment, with her back to the dining room, and then she turned around and walked back to her seat and sat down and picked up her napkin and put it in her lap. "Dad," she said, "can someone help you with your turkey? You can't hold the fork." I lifted my right arm out of the sling. I peeled the Velcro off the cast. I pulled the whole thing free in one motion and set it on the table next to the cranberry sauce. My right hand was perfectly fine. I flexed my fingers. I picked up my fork to look on Tate's mother's face. I'm not proud of it, but I will carry that look with me as a kind of warm stone in my pocket for the rest of my life. "I'll manage, sweetheart," I said. We ate Thanksgiving dinner. The conversation was strange for a while, then it wasn't. My brother told a story about our father. The neighbor's kid spilled milk. Penelope made everyone laugh about her fake medical procedure. Sutton ate 3 plates. She hadn't eaten 3 plates of anything in 6 months. After dessert, when most of the guests had left and the kitchen was being cleaned up by my sister-in-law and the neighbors, I sat with Sutton on the back porch. It was cold. We had blankets over our laps. The yard was full of the long blue shadows that come at the end of a Connecticut November day. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, why didn't you just tell me? Back in June, when you knew." I thought about it. I thought about the right answer, the one that would let me off the hook. I didn't give it to her. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me," I said, "and I was afraid that if I tried, I'd lose you." She was quiet a while longer. And then she leaned her head against my shoulder, my left shoulder, the good one, and she said, "I'm sorry, Daddy." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I sat there in the cold with my daughter's head on my shoulder, and I watched the light go out of the sky over the trees, and I thought about her mother, and I thought about the long road that had brought us back here, to this porch, to this quiet, and I thought about how every single thing I had ever learned in 40 years of practicing law had come down in the end to this. You protect your own. You do it patiently. You do it correctly. You do it within the law, because the law is the difference between justice and revenge, and you owe that distinction to the people who built it before you. But you protect your own. Tate Bellwether pleaded guilty in February to avoid trial. He took 22 years. Federal, no parole. Rusk took 14. The trust money is still in the trust. Sutton is back at her old job. She sees a therapist on Tuesdays. She comes home most weekends. We have dinner. We don't talk about it much anymore. We don't need to. This past Thanksgiving, 1 year later, she sat at my table again. No cast, no sling, no marshals at the door. Just her and me and Penelope and my brother and the neighbor's kid, who is now 13 and eats more turkey than 3 grown men. Sutton stood up before we ate, and she lifted her glass and she said, "To Mom, and to Dad, who taught me what a real man looks like." I lifted my glass with my right hand, the hand that was never broken, the hand that drafted that trust 10 years ago, the hand that, on a cold morning in a Stanford office, had pointed at a photograph and said, "Here, this one, we move on this one." The hand that, when it mattered most, had held my daughters. That, friends, is what a lesson looks like. Not the kind he was bragging about at my table, the kind the world quietly teaches a man like him, in a foyer on a Thursday in November, with the smell of turkey behind him and the feel of cold steel on his wrists, and the sound of a door closing on the only future he ever bothered to imagine. If you're listening to this and you know someone like my daughter, someone who has gotten quiet, someone whose ring spins loose, someone who flinches before she answers a question, do not look away. Do not tell yourself it's none of your business. Do not assume she'll ask for help when she's ready, because by then it may be too late. Pick up the phone, drive over, sit on the stoop. Do the slow, careful, patient work of being there. And if you ever find yourself across a dinner table from a man who is bragging about teaching someone a lesson, smile at him. Pour yourself a glass of water. Wait for the doorbell. Some lessons take a while to come around. But they always come around in the end. I've been turning this story over in my mind for almost a year now, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the moment the marshals walked through my door, or the look on Tate's face when his wine glass shattered on the foyer tile. It's the long, quiet stretch in between, the 5 months I spent watching my daughter disappear inside her own marriage, and choosing, every single day, to be patient instead of loud. Patience is a kind of strength I didn't understand when I was younger. As a young prosecutor, I thought strength meant moving fast and hitting hard. The older I got, the more I realized that real strength is the discipline to wait until you can move correctly. Tate believed he was the smart one in that house, because he could yell. Sutton believed she was weak because she couldn't yell back. Both of them were wrong. The hand that drafted that trust 10 years ago, quietly, without telling anyone, was stronger than any fist he ever raised. That's the cause and effect I want to leave you with. Tate didn't fail because he was unlucky. He failed because he built his whole life on the assumption that the people around him were soft. He never bothered to ask why my mother-in-law had insisted on that clause being removed, and why I had insisted, just as firmly, that it stay. He never asked Sutton about her father's career. He never wondered why a man who'd been a federal prosecutor for 40 years would stay quiet at a dinner table. He mistook silence for surrender. That mistake cost him 22 years. If you're a younger man listening to this, hear me on this. Cleverness is not wisdom. A man who is clever can win an argument. A man who is wise can lose 10 arguments and still walk out with everything that matters. The difference is character. Character is what you do when nobody is watching, and Tate Bellwether had no character at all. Which is why the moment somebody started watching, his whole life came apart in 11 seconds in the snow. And to anyone listening who feels small right now, who feels stuck, who feels like the loud person in your life has somehow convinced you that you don't matter, I want you to hear what my daughter learned. You are not weak because you've been quiet. You are not foolish because you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. The moment Sutton sat down at my kitchen table and said, "I knew, Dad," she stopped being a victim. She became a witness. And a witness, I'll tell you after 40 years in courtrooms, is the most powerful person in any room. Be patient. Be honest with yourself, even when honesty hurts. Build your life on something that can hold weight. And when the time comes to act, act once, act correctly, and don't look back. That's all any of us are really doing here, trying to leave behind a table where the people we love can sit down safely and eat.